This is an interesting topic, also maybe slightly controversial title, depending on how you want to take that specific turn of phrase. So I'm going to split this video into two components. The first component is going to be discussing the study to a degree, and then the second component is going to be talking about what we need to do about this with information, what we need to do with this information as clinicians. So yeah, there is a slight difference between those two components. I think it changes how we think about rheumatoid arthritis, what we do with patients when they attend slightly. So I'm just going to comment on that in the second half of the video. So this video comes from a study that's been published. So this was published in the Journal of Rheumatology, February 2025. That is now, as I record this, very hot off the press, as they would say. The ink is barely dry on this journal. So the title of this particular study, Changes at Presentation in Patients with Early Rheumatoid Arthritis, a 24-year study of the early undifferentiated polyarthritis cohort. So this is interesting. I'll put a link into the full study. It is currently open access. I don't know if this is going to be open access forever, but it is currently open access. Their objective was to analyse changes in baseline characteristics of patients with very early rheumatoid arthritis. And just quickly, if you can't be bothered to watch the entire video, the conclusion was that baseline characteristics of patients have evolved since 2005 towards less seropositivity and lower blood inflammation, but with more comorbidities and milder erosive damage at baseline. Which would suggest that rheumatoid arthritis is becoming milder over that period of time. So the first thing that I want to comment on is this milder component, because that's the bit that people are going to get a little bit hung up on or a little bit stressed about, is what we mean when we say the word milder in these diseases. And if we talked to patients, they would have a different definition of the word milder in this case than we would in research or from a clinician point of view. So obviously you will note that has not said that these patients are getting less symptoms, okay? And that is the difference here when we talk about the word milder. So from a clinical point of view, as we've just sort of alluded to, mild, moderate, severe sort of talks to those things we can see, we can find. So that's, as we said, that's blood inflammation markers, things like CRP and ESR. So you might have a mild elevation CRP, ESR, or you might have a severe severe elevation ESR, CRP. Obviously, the patient, you as a patient, the person doesn't know that. They have a different definition because they are describing the symptoms that they are experiencing. So they might say, "Oh, I've got a mild amount of pain," 2 out of 10 on a pain scale as an arbitrary description, versus a severe amount of pain, 8 out of 10 on a pain scale. Those things are separated, and you'll notice, as I talked about just there, they did not talk about the symptoms that are presenting. So these patients are still suffering with pain, stiffness, swelling, redness in the same way. They are just not showing the objective signs of rheumatoid arthritis in quite the same way. So that's what has changed. That's what we're commenting on in this article, is those objective findings. So the inflammatory markers not quite as raised, the seropositivity, so that's rheumatoid factor, not as elevated or not elevated at all in more patients, and less erosions at baseline. So patients, when they attend to rheumatology and are diagnosed, less of them are showing the erosions in their joints already. So that's what we're commenting on when we say the word milder. As I say, I cannot comment because it doesn't specify whether these patients with these people are getting less pain, less redness, less swelling, and less stiffness. I would suggest not, being that it's not commented on. So let's go into this in a little bit more detail because the differences are interesting. They obviously did this over a very long period of time, 24 years specifically, and they separated the people into three cohorts. So there was an initial cohort, then a middle, and then an end, so they could compare what was happening in those three different periods of times. Or I think the word epoch probably is a correct use of that word. I like that word. I'm hoping I'm using that correctly. You can probably put in the comments whether I've got that wrong, but a period of time being an epoch. But, well, I'm going off topic. So what they saw, like I say, is there are some complicated differences, but essentially in that first cohort versus the last cohort, the third cohort, they saw that the patients were showing less seropositivity, so less rheumatoid factor positivity. And this means that the rheumatoid factor, whilst isn't diagnostic as a blood test, it does indicate more severe disease. So the higher the rheumatoid factor, the more likely someone is to have severe disease. So as we talked about, that's clinically, so erosions and requiring of medication to manage the disease, that kind of stuff. They also noted a decrease in the inflammatory markers, so the ESR and the CRP, and then they also noted this reduction in the erosions at baseline. Now, these things are all very good for long-term outcomes because, as I sort of alluded to, higher seropositivity rates, or higher levels of rheumatoid factor, higher levels of inflammation, and erosions are all indicators of the more severe disease. And that will follow the path through the disease process. So having lower levels of that at the beginning means you are much more likely to have better outcomes in the long term, which is great. Now, you could argue that these are all related and probably follow on from the seronegativity. So people who are seropositive, so with high rheumatoid factor, are also more likely to have higher inflammation in the blood and more likely to get the erosions. So they might all be the marker of the same thing, but sort of irrelevant really in the grand scheme of things. We're seeing these changes, which are really good. They're good predictors of long-term outcomes. Now, what I particularly find it as well interesting is that within the questions that they saw, they did see an increase in cardiovascular comorbidities, so heart disease, lung issues, etc., high blood pressure, but a lower exposure to active smoking. So it might well be that the smoking is starting to modulate some of this, where because people are smoking less, they're less likely to become seropositive, which would be an interesting sort of sociological health outcome. And the higher prevalence of cardiovascular disease, they've put down to better screening. So they aren't necessarily saying that people have less high inflammation, etc., but more cardiovascular disease because of the rheumatoid arthritis, which is a risk factor in itself of getting cardiovascular disease. But remember, this is at baseline, so this is at initial diagnosis. So they're putting that down to better screening over that period of time, so that first cohort versus the third cohort. So these are all really interesting outcomes, and I think really reassuring, I would hope, for a good number of people who are getting a new diagnosis of rheumatoid arthritis, that outcomes are likely to be better. But it is particularly in these seronegative patients that they saw the improved other factors, so the lower inflammation, ESR, CRP, and the lower likelihood of the erosions. The people who were seropositive seem to be remarkably stable. That still seems to be the still very similar outcomes at baseline comparative in the first group versus the third group. So it's not that those people are doing a lot better than they were. They're sort of stable. They've not deteriorated, but they haven't improved. But the seropositive people have improved. So their actual outcomes are better at baseline, and there are also slightly more of them. So there's an increased number of seronegative people. So that if you take the cohort of rheumatoid arthritis patients in total, not only are the seronegative people doing slightly better, but there are also more of them in that group. So this is a real bonus. This is a real benefit to this, and hopefully, as they note further down in the study, this is a trend that will continue, and more people will move towards that seronegative, and the cohort will do better. So this is really good. So that's really interesting. Hope you found that really interesting. They did have quite a lot of patients in this study, and obviously done over a long period of time. So really good robust data collection here. I haven't got any problems with that. Fascinating thing to read. Do go read the whole thing. It is of lots of interest.